Ethan's worn sneakers slapped against the cracked sidewalk as he trudged home. He knew this route like the back of his hand, past the gauntlet of gleaming car dealerships lining Main Street. The late afternoon sun glinted off the hoods of the imported cars, giving them a showroom shine that felt a world away from his own life. He paused, letting his gaze drift over the polished rows of Mercedes and BMWs, indulging in a fleeting fantasy of being behind the wheel. It was a foolish daydream, he knew, but he couldn't resist. A midnight blue BMW M5 caught his eye. He lingered a moment longer, admiring its sleek lines, imagining the thrill of owning something like that someday, a symbol of a future that felt impossibly distant. A future far removed from the endless cycle of low-wage jobs and financial stress that seemed to be his family's destiny. "Hey, kid, move along," a gruff voice barked. Ethan blinked, startled. A security guard, built like a linebacker and radiating suspicion, was approaching him. The man's cap was pulled low, shading his eyes, but Ethan could feel the weight of his gaze, the unspoken assumption. It was clear the guard didn't think he belonged there. The narrow eyes sized him up, radiating distrust. Ethan mumbled an apology, his face flushing. He hurried away, his chest tightening. He should have known better than to stop. This wasn't the first time he'd felt those eyes on him, the silent judgments, the subtle accusations. He shoved his hands deeper into his pockets and kept walking, not looking back. The opulent dealership strip gave way to a more familiar street lined with modest, aging houses. The lawns weren't perfectly manicured. The cars were older, some bearing the scars of dents or faded paint. It was a stark contrast to the gleaming displays he'd just left behind, a different universe entirely. Finally, he reached his house, a small, weathered bungalow perched at the edge of the block. The paint was peeling around the windows, and the porch sagged slightly, but it was home. He pushed open the creaking front door. The living room was cramped, but filled with memories. A few old photos lined the mantelpiece. His dad's smiling face gazed down from one of the frames, an image frozen in time. Beside the photos, his father's old tools hung in neat rows on a pegboard, a silent testament to the once busy garage that was now just a storage space, a casualty of the accident. Ethan swallowed hard, his eyes lingering on the familiar tools for a moment longer before he headed into the kitchen. His mom, Sarah, was already home, slumped at the small kitchen table, a daunting stack of bills spread before her. She looked up when she heard him enter, forcing a tired smile, but Ethan could see the worry etched into the lines around her eyes. She worked tirelessly, juggling double shifts between a local diner and cleaning houses, and even that barely kept them afloat. "Hey," she said, her voice a little too bright. "How was school?" "It was all right," he shrugged, moving to the refrigerator. He opened it, peering inside, even though he knew there wasn't much there. "You okay, Mom?" She waved her hand dismissively, like she was swatting away a fly. Same old," she said, but her eyes kept returning to the stack of bills. "Got a notice from the landlord today. They want the rent by the end of the month, or they're threatening eviction." She tried to keep her voice casual, but it wavered slightly, betraying her anxiety. Ethan closed the refrigerator and turned, leaning back against it. He didn't know what to say. It wasn't the first time they were late on rent, but the thought of losing the house, the only home he'd ever known, made his chest ache. He had to do something. There was no way they could let this place go, not with everything his dad had built, everything he'd left behind. "Don't worry, Mom," he said, trying to make his voice sound steady and confident. "I'll figure something out. Another job or something." She offered a weak smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I know you will, Ethan. You're a good kid." She reached over and squeezed his arm before turning back to the bills, her brow furrowed in concentration. Later, in his small, Spartan room, Ethan sat on the floor next to his dad's old toolbox. He ran his fingers over the cold metal latches, tracing the familiar contours. His dad used to say that working with tools wasn't just about fixing things. It was about understanding them, about finding the broken part, figuring out how everything worked together. That's what made his dad such a good mechanic, and that's what Ethan aspired to be. He wanted to be good enough to fix things, to make something of himself, even if it seemed impossible most of the time. He heard his mom turn on the TV in the living room, the canned laughter of a sitcom filtering into his room, a hollow sound against the backdrop of their financial worries. He sighed, pulling open the toolbox. The creak of the metal hinges filled the silence. Inside, everything was still in its place. The wrenches, the screwdrivers, even the small magnifying glasses Dad used for delicate work. It was all he had left of him, a tangible connection to the man he missed so deeply. He spent the next hour tinkering with an old bicycle chain, trying to distract himself from the eviction notice, trying to keep his mind off the car dealerships, off the security guard's accusatory gaze, off the shiny cars that seemed to belong to a different world. A world that wasn't meant for him. He disassembled the chain link by link, cleaning off the old grease and grime, losing himself in the intricate workings of the mechanism. He ended up staying up later than he meant to, the chain lying in pieces beside him on the floor. When he finally lay back on his thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, he thought about how things could be different. If he had a real job, real skills, maybe they wouldn't be in this situation. Maybe he could fix more than just a broken chain. But he didn't know how to get from here to there. It felt like there was this vast chasm separating him from the future he dreamed of, and he didn't know how to cross it. But he had to try. He had to find a way. The next day, he walked to school as usual. It was another cool autumn morning, the fallen leaves crunching under his sneakers as he hurried down the street. He passed the car dealerships again, but this time he kept his head down, refusing to look. He didn't need the reminder, the visual representation of his own perceived inadequacy. Instead, he turned off early, cutting through a back road that led closer to the school. The route was quieter, more secluded, lined with older trees that formed a canopy overhead. It was the kind of path that didn't draw much attention, a place where he could be invisible. He was almost at the corner when he spotted it. A car, a silver Mercedes-Benz, sitting by the roadside, its hood popped open, steam curling out from beneath it. An older man in a sharp, expensive-looking suit stood nearby, a deep frown etched on his face. Ethan paused. Something in him urged him to keep moving, to avoid getting involved. It wasn't his problem. He didn't need more people looking at him, judging him, assuming the worst. But then the man looked up, their eyes met for a fleeting second, and Ethan saw the genuine frustration and helplessness in his gaze. The uncertainty. He hesitated, then, almost before he knew what he was doing, he crossed the street, making his way toward the stranded motorist. "Hey, need some help?" Ethan asked, his voice a little shaky. The man looked at him, raising his eyebrows in surprise. "You." His tone was skeptical, his eyes sweeping over Ethan's worn sneakers and the faded backpack slung over his shoulder. Ethan nodded, swallowing down his nerves. "I know a bit about cars. I could take a look." The man, still looking unsure, sighed. "Well, it's not like I have many other options right now," he muttered, stepping aside. "Go ahead." Ethan dropped his bag and cautiously approached the car, peering under the hood. His eyes quickly scanned the engine, the wiring, the radiator. He knew enough to recognize the problem: overheating, likely a faulty water pump. He glanced back at the man, whose expression was somewhere between hopeful and doubtful. "This might take a minute," Ethan said, already reaching into his bag for his small set of tools. The man just nodded, crossing his arms as he watched. Ethan got to work, the familiar feel of the tools grounding him. It wasn't much, but it was something he could do, a way to help, even if it was just for a stranger stranded on the side of the road. Ethan leaned over the engine, his hands moving with a practiced familiarity, as if the engine parts were pieces of a puzzle he'd solved 100 times before. The old Mercedes was a classic, the kind of car his dad used to admire. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, and started loosening a few bolts to get a better look, the chill of the autumn air biting at his exposed fingers.